The photo you see on the screen captures one of the most heartbreaking moments in entertainment history. February 1994, the Landmark Theatre in Richmond, Virginia. Frank Sinatra stands frozen on stage in front of 12,000 people. His mouth is open. His hand is reaching toward his head in that universal gesture of someone desperately trying to remember something. He's staring at the teleprompter positioned 15 feet in front of him. The words are right there. And now, the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. The opening lines to My Way, the song he's performed over 10,000 times across 5 decades, but the words mean nothing to him. His brain cannot process them. His mind is blank. And in this exact moment, captured by a photographer in the front row, the audience realizes they're watching something terrible unfold. They're not watching a legend perform. They're watching a legend disappear. Look at his eyes in this photo. That's not confusion. That's terror. The terror of a man who's spent 70 years in complete control, suddenly realizing he has no control left. Frank Sinatra, the man who intimidated presidents, who commanded every room he entered, who never showed weakness, is completely, utterly lost, and 12,000 people are watching it happen. This isn't a story about retirement. This isn't about a graceful exit or an elderly performer slowing down. This is about Alzheimer's disease stealing Frank Sinatra's identity in real time, on stage, in front of the world. This is about a family watching their father disintegrate and making the impossible choice to let him keep performing because taking away the stage would kill him faster than the disease. And the most disturbing part, they knew. His daughter knew. His wife knew. His son knew. And they put him on stage anyway. Night after night, city after city, even as he forgot where he was, even as he forgot who he was. Was it love? Was it exploitation? By the end of this video, you'll have to decide for yourself. Let's go back to 1993. Frank Sinatra is 77 years old. By all accounts, he should be retired. He's had a heart attack. He's had bladder cancer. He's had a hernia operation. His hearing is deteriorating. He wears a hearing aid that constantly malfunctions during shows. But Frank Sinatra doesn't know how to be anything except a performer. It's not what he does, it's who he is. In March 1993, he announces the ultimate event, a 40-week, 80-city tour with Liza Minnelli and Sammy Davis Jr., 3 legends, 1 stage. The media calls it the concert event of the decade. Tickets sell out in hours, but there's a problem. Sammy Davis Jr. is dying, throat cancer. He's lost 60 pounds. He can barely speak. In May 1990, 3 years before the tour is scheduled to start, Sammy dies. The tour is postponed, then restructured, then finally launches in 1993 with just Frank and Liza. But behind the scenes, Frank's family is noticing something wrong, something that has nothing to do with his physical health. Tina Sinatra, his daughter, later describes it in interviews. Her father would call her at 2 p.m. They'd talk for 20 minutes. At 3 p.m., he'd call again, asking the exact same questions. At 4 p.m., another call. Same questions. No memory of the previous conversations. When Tina mentioned it to him, Frank became defensive, angry. "I never called you," he'd insist. But the phone records proved otherwise. He'd walk into rooms and forget why he entered. He'd introduce people he'd known for 40 years and get their names wrong. He'd tell the same stories multiple times in the same evening. With no awareness he'd already told them. Small things, easy to dismiss as normal aging. Everyone forgets things at 77, right? But then came the rehearsals for the 1993 tour. Frank couldn't remember the arrangements to songs he'd recorded. These weren't new songs. These were standards he'd been singing since the 1940s. I've Got You Under My Skin, Fly Me to the Moon, New York, New York, songs embedded in his muscle memory. But during rehearsals, he'd stop mid-verse. What comes next? He'd ask the orchestra. His conductor, his own son, Frank Sinatra Jr., would have to feed him lines. The backup singers noticed it, the musicians noticed it, but nobody said anything. This is Frank Sinatra. You don't question Frank Sinatra. His son implemented a solution. Teleprompters, not the small discreet kind used for speeches. Massive teleprompters positioned at multiple angles around the stage, so no matter where Frank looked, he'd see lyrics. The official explanation to the press: Mr. Sinatra wants to ensure perfection. The teleprompters are for complex arrangements. The real reason: Frank Sinatra could no longer perform without them. But even with the teleprompters, there were problems. Frank's eyes no longer tracked correctly. He'd read the wrong line. He'd skip entire verses. He'd sing the second verse twice and skip the third entirely. Frank Jr. developed a system of conducting that included lip-syncing every word from the orchestra pit. If Frank lost his place, he could look down and see his son mouthing the lyrics. Tina Sinatra would stand in the wings with oversized cue cards, ready to hold them up if her father looked lost. The entire production became an elaborate support system designed to hide what was happening to Frank Sinatra's brain. The family had meetings, arguments. Barbara Marx, Frank's 4th wife, insisted the tour continue. Frank wanted to perform. Taking that away would destroy him. He lived for the stage. Without it, he'd have nothing. Tina disagreed. She saw her father struggling. She wanted to cancel the tour, go public with his condition, let him retire with dignity. But Frank made the decision himself. He wanted to perform. At 77 years old, despite the memory lapses, despite the confusion, he insisted, "I'm not done yet." So the tour launched. September 1993. Opening night in Las Vegas, 12,000 people, standing ovation before Frank sang a single note. And for that first show, the system worked. The teleprompters functioned. Frank Jr. Ed's lip-syncing saved him twice. Tina never had to use her cue cards. Frank finished the show. The reviews were positive. The chairman still has it, one critic wrote. But that critic hadn't been backstage. He hadn't seen Frank in his dressing room after the show, asking his bodyguard, "What city are we in?" He hadn't seen Barbara Marx gently reminding her husband that they were in Las Vegas, the city where he'd performed 5,000 times. The tour continued. October, November, December, 30 shows. And with each show, Frank deteriorated a little more. January 1994, 15 months into the tour, Frank Sinatra is 78 years old. The warning signs are no longer subtle. They're catastrophic. He forgets which city he's performing in. During a show in Phoenix, he welcomes the audience to beautiful Detroit. The audience laughs, thinking it's a joke. It's not. Backstage, Tina has to show him the venue placard to convince him where he actually is. During a concert in Miami, he introduces Liza Minnelli as Judy Garland. Liza freezes. The audience gasps. Frank doesn't understand why. "Judy's here tonight, everybody," he says, gesturing to Liza. "Give her a hand." Liza has to gently correct him on stage. "It's me, Frank." "Liza." Frank blinks, confused, then continues singing like nothing happened. He walks off stage mid-song. During a performance in Chicago, Frank is halfway through Come Fly With Me when he simply stops singing, turns around and walks into the wings. The orchestra keeps playing. The audience thinks it's part of the act. It's not. Tina finds him in the hallway, disoriented. "I need to go home," he tells her. She walks him back on stage. Frank finishes the show with no memory of leaving. His teleprompter dependency becomes total and absolute. He cannot sing a single line without reading it. But even with the words directly in front of him, he struggles. His eyes dart around. He reads lyrics from the wrong song. During one show, he's singing That's Life, but reading lyrics from The Lady is a Tramp. The words don't match the music. The audience realizes something is very wrong. His timing is gone. Frank Sinatra's legendary sense of rhythm, the ability to swing behind or ahead of the beat, disappears. He sings mechanically, robotically, like someone reading a grocery list. The phrasing that made him an icon is gone. He's just reciting words. One night in Virginia, he performs My Way at 8:30 p.m. The audience loves it. Standing ovation. 15 minutes later, he performs My Way again. The same song. The orchestra is confused. Do we play it? Frank insists. So they play it. He sings it again with no awareness he's already performed it. The audience is uncomfortable now. This isn't entertainment. This is watching someone suffer. Backstage, the fights escalate. Tina begs him to cancel the remaining 43 shows. "Dad, you need rest. You need to see doctors. You need to stop." Frank refuses. "I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me. We're finishing the tour." Barbara Marx insists the tour continue. In her mind, Frank needs purpose. He needs the routine. He needs the applause. Without the stage, he'll deteriorate faster. Better to let him perform and feel alive than to force him into retirement and watch him fade away. Frank Jr. is caught in an impossible position. He watches his father disintegrate every night from the conductor's podium. He sees the confusion, the fear, the moments when Frank doesn't recognize him, but he also honors his father's wish to keep performing. If Dad wants to sing, Frank Jr. says in interviews years later, who am I to stop him? The media starts noticing. Reviews shift from critiquing the performance to expressing concern for Frank's health. One journalist writes, "This felt less like a concert and more like watching someone we love suffer in public." Another, "Sinatra should retire before the memories we have are replaced by the image of a man who can't remember his own songs." But the tour doesn't stop. 40 shows become 45. Then 50. The schedule is relentless. 3 shows a week, different cities, different hotels. Frank can't remember where he is most of the time. He wanders hotel hallways at 3 a.m., disoriented. Security has to escort him back to his room. One night, Frank knocks on a stranger's hotel door at 2 a.m. When they answer, he says, "I'm looking for Ava." Ava Gardner, his second wife. She's been dead for 4 years. The stranger recognizes him, calls hotel security. They find Frank in the hallway, crying, asking for a woman who no longer exists. These stories don't make it to the press. The family keeps them buried, but the crew knows. The musicians know. Everyone around Frank Sinatra knows he's not okay. And everyone stays silent because he's Frank Sinatra, and you don't challenge Frank Sinatra. February 1994. Richmond, Virginia. The Landmark Theater. Show number 52. What happens next becomes the defining image of Frank Sinatra's cognitive collapse. February 19th, 1994, 7:30 p.m. Frank Sinatra is in his dressing room at the Landmark Theater. He's been on tour for 17 months. He's exhausted. His hands shake as he adjusts his tuxedo. Tina is with him, helping him get ready. What city is this? Frank asks. Richmond, Dad. Virginia. Frank nods. 10 minutes later, what city is this? Richmond. He nods again. 5 minutes later, where are we? Tina doesn't answer this time. She just helps him put on his jacket. 8 p.m. The orchestra is in position. Frank Jr. is at the conductor's podium. The teleprompters are set up at 3 different angles. Tina is in the wings with her cue cards. Barbara Marx is in the audience, front row. Everything is ready. 8:15 p.m. Frank Sinatra walks on stage. The crowd erupts. 12,000 people on their feet, screaming, crying. Some of these people have waited 50 years to see Frank Sinatra live. For many, this will be their only chance. They don't know they're about to witness his breakdown. Frank waves. He smiles. The applause continues for 90 seconds. The orchestra begins the opening song, Come Fly With Me. Frank nails it. No mistakes. The audience is thrilled. Maybe tonight will be okay. Second song, I've Got You Under My Skin. Frank loses his place twice, but recovers using the teleprompter. Still acceptable. Third song, The Lady is a Tramp. Frank forgets the lyrics in the second verse. Frank Jr. is mouthing the words frantically from the orchestra pit. Frank sees him, recovers, finishes the song. The audience doesn't notice. Then comes song number 7, My Way. The orchestra begins the iconic piano introduction. The teleprompter displays the opening line. And now, the end is near. Frank opens his mouth to sing. Nothing comes out. He stares at the teleprompter. The words are right there. And now, the end is near. He reads them. He sees them. But his brain cannot connect the words to his voice. The cognitive pathway is broken. 5 seconds pass. The orchestra continues playing, waiting for him to come in. He doesn't. Frank's face changes. Confusion, then panic. His hand moves toward his head, that instinctive gesture of someone trying to physically retrieve a lost memory. His fingers touch his temple. Press, as if pushing his brain will make it work. 10 seconds. The audience shifts in their seats. This isn't right. Something's wrong. Frank Jr. stands up from the conductor's podium. He's mouthing the words clearly, desperately. And now, the end is near. Frank doesn't see him. He's staring past the teleprompter into nothing. 15 seconds. Tina is crying in the wings. She's holding her cue cards, but she can't lift them. She's frozen. Barbara Marx is on her feet in the audience. Her hands are over her mouth. Frank looks at the conductor, his son, and into the live microphone. In front of 12,000 people, he says, "What song is this?" The audience gasps, audible gasps. This is not part of the show. This is not Frank Sinatra, the performer. This is Frank Sinatra, the patient, lost, confused, afraid. Frank Jr. restarts the song. "Dad, it's my way, your song, just follow me." The orchestra begins again. Frank starts singing, but he's singing the wrong lyrics. He's singing Strangers in the Night over the instrumental track for My Way. The words don't match, the melody doesn't match. It's musical chaos. The orchestra tries to adjust. They can't. There's no arrangement for what Frank is doing. He stops singing, looks around. "This isn't right," he says into the microphone. Frank Jr. stops the orchestra. Silence. 12,000 people in complete silence. You can hear Frank breathing into the microphone, shaky, panicked. "I'm sorry," Frank says. "I'm sorry. I need a minute." He walks off stage. The curtain closes. The house lights come up. An announcement is made over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Sinatra needs a brief intermission due to technical difficulties. Please remain in your seats." Technical difficulties. That's the official story. Backstage, Frank is sitting in a chair in the hallway. Tina is next to him, holding his hand. Barbara Marx is crouched in front of him, talking softly. Frank is staring at the floor. "I don't remember the song," he says. "It's okay, Frank. You're okay. I don't remember my own song." A doctor is called. He checks Frank's vitals. Blood pressure elevated but stable. Heart rate fast but regular. The doctor asks Frank basic questions. "What's your name?" Frank answers correctly. "Where are you?" Frank says, "Las Vegas." "Wrong. What year is it?" Frank says, 1972. "Wrong." The doctor pulls Tina aside. He shouldn't be on stage. He's disoriented. He needs a hospital and a full neurological evaluation. Tina nods. She already knows, but Frank insists on finishing the show. "I'm not quitting. I don't quit." After 20 minutes, he returns to the stage. The audience applauds cautiously, relieved he's back, but worried about what they just witnessed. Frank performs 6 more songs. He reads every word off the teleprompter, mechanically, no emotion, no phrasing, just reading. The audience is silent. This isn't a concert. This is an assisted living facility's karaoke night. Frank finishes with, "New York, New York." The audience gives him a standing ovation, but it's not the ovation of joy. It's the ovation of pity. They're applauding a man who just survived something terrible in front of them. After the show, Frank returns to his hotel room. He doesn't remember the breakdown. He asks Tina, "How was the show tonight?" "It was fine, Dad. The audience liked it. They loved you." Frank smiles. "Good, that's good." He has no memory of forgetting My Way. His brain has already erased the incident. But the 12,000 people in that theater will never forget it. Neither will the bootleg recording that circulates online within a week. Neither will the photographer whose image captures the exact moment Frank Sinatra realized he was disappearing. The Richmond incident should have ended the tour. Any reasonable person would have cancelled the remaining shows, issued a statement about Frank's health, and let him retire privately. But that's not what happened. The family held an emergency meeting. The tour had 6 shows left. 6 cities: Phoenix, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Palm Desert. 6 more chances for Richmond to happen again. Barbara Marx argued they should finish. Frank wanted to finish. Cancelling would humiliate him. It would tell the world he was sick. She believed, genuinely believed, that performing kept him alive. Without the stage, he'd have no reason to get out of bed. Tina argued the opposite. Her father was suffering. Every show was traumatic. The Richmond audience watched a man have a medical emergency on stage. How many more people needed to witness that? When does love become exploitation? Frank Jr. was silent during the debate. He'd spent 17 months watching his father forget songs he'd sung 10,000 times. He'd spent 17 months lip-syncing words from the conductor's podium, trying to save his father's dignity. He was exhausted, emotionally destroyed, but he also knew his father. Frank Sinatra would rather die on stage than retire to a hospital bed. The decision was made. The tour would continue, but there was a new protocol. Frank's doctor would be present at every remaining show. If Frank showed any signs of medical distress, the show would stop immediately. No arguments. The teleprompters would be larger, brighter, positioned even closer. Frank Jr. would not just conduct, he'd stand next to his father on stage for certain songs, ready to step in. The family also made another decision. No media, no interviews, no photos. The last 6 shows would be closed press. They couldn't control bootleg recordings, but they could control official documentation. After Frank died, there would be no archival footage of his final deterioration. The Richmond recording was quietly buried. The venue was contacted. The bootleg recordings online were hit with copyright claims. Anthropic's lawyers worked overtime to erase evidence of what happened that night. It didn't work. The internet is forever, but they tried. February 20, show 53. Frank forgets the lyrics to Fly Me to the Moon, but he doesn't stop this time. He just reads off the teleprompter. No emotion. The audience notices. They're uncomfortable, but there's no breakdown. The show finishes. March 20, 1994. Los Angeles, show 54. Frank introduces Liza Minnelli as Nancy. Nancy is his ex-wife. Nancy is not on stage. Liza gently corrects him. Frank looks confused but continues. The show finishes. March 6, 1994. The final show. Frank Sinatra walks on stage at the McCallum Theatre. 3,000 people. Smaller venue. Intimate. His home crowd, Palm Desert, is near his compound in Rancho Mirage. He performs 12 songs. He forgets lyrics to every single one. He reads entirely off the teleprompter. Mechanically, robotically. There's no Frank Sinatra on that stage. There's just a 78-year-old man with dementia reading words he doesn't understand. During the encore, Frank performs My Way one final time. He gets through it. No mistakes, but there's no emotion, no signature phrasing. He's just reading words. The song ends. The audience stands. Applause. Frank waves, smiles, walks off stage. No farewell speech, no announcement, no acknowledgement that this is the end. Frank Sinatra simply exits the stage for the final time in his life, and nobody tells him it's the final time. Backstage, Tina asks, "How do you feel, Dad?" "Tired." "When's the next show?" "Soon." Tina lies. "We'll let you know." There would be no next show, but Frank didn't need to know that. Not yet. March 7, 1994. The day after the final show, Frank's family makes a decision. No public announcement, no retirement speech, no press conference, just silence. The official story given to media requests. Mr. Sinatra is taking a break from touring to focus on personal time with family. The real story. Frank Sinatra has advanced dementia, likely Alzheimer's disease, and can no longer perform. For the next year, the family kept Frank's condition private. When friends called to visit, they were told Frank was resting or not feeling well. When reporters asked for interviews, they were told Frank was unavailable. The most famous entertainer in the world disappeared from public life, and nobody asked why. But the people who visited Frank during this time tell a different story. Comedian Tom Dreesen, Frank's longtime opening act, visited him in 1994. He found Frank sitting in his living room, staring at the television. Frank didn't recognize him. Dreesen introduced himself. "Frank, it's Tom. We did 100 shows together." Frank smiled politely. "That's nice. Do I know you?" Dreesen left in tears. Quincy Jones visited later that year. Frank called him Ray Charles, a man he'd known for 50 years. Quincy didn't correct him. He just sat with Frank, held his hand, and left. By late 1994, Frank could no longer form complete sentences. He'd start a thought and lose it mid-word. He'd stare at family photos and not recognize his own children. He'd ask for Ava Gardner, dead since 1990. He'd ask for his mother, dead since 1977. In December 1994, Frank's family quietly confirmed to close friends that he had memory issues. Still no public announcement. Still no use of the word Alzheimer's. January 1995, Frank is hospitalized with a pinched nerve. While in the hospital, doctors perform cognitive tests. The results are devastating. advanced Alzheimer's disease, irreversible, progressive, fatal. Barbara Marx makes the decision to keep Frank at home. No nursing facility, no hospital. He'll die in his own bed, surrounded by family. It's the most dignity she can offer him. But here's the question nobody asks publicly. Why did it take until 1995 for doctors to officially diagnose what everyone already knew in 1993? The answer is uncomfortable. As long as there was no official diagnosis, Frank could keep performing. As long as nobody used the word Alzheimer's, the tour could continue. As long as doctors didn't put it in writing, the family could justify the decision to keep him on stage. Barbara Marx defends this in later interviews. Frank wanted to perform. Who was I to take that away from him? He lived for the stage. Without it, he had nothing. Tina Sinatra disagrees. In her memoir, she writes, "We should have stopped the tour after Richmond. We knew he was sick. We knew he couldn't remember. But we let him keep performing because stopping meant admitting defeat. And Frank Sinatra never admitted defeat, even when defeat was staring us in the face." 1995 becomes 1996. Frank rarely speaks. He sits in his chair, staring at nothing. He doesn't recognize Barbara most days. He doesn't recognize his children. Music is played for him, his own recordings, but there's no recognition, no response. The man who lived for music doesn't hear it anymore. 1996 becomes 1997. Frank stops eating solid food. He's fed through a tube. He weighs 90 pounds. His body is shutting down, but his heart keeps beating. 1997 becomes 1998. May 14, 1998, 10:50 p.m. Frank Sinatra dies at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause, heart attack. The real cause, Alzheimer's disease, destroyed his brain, and his body finally gave up. He was 82 years old, but the real Frank Sinatra, the mind, the personality, the chairman of the board, died 4 years earlier in a hotel hallway when he couldn't remember where Ava was. Or maybe he died on stage in Richmond when he forgot the lyrics to My Way. Or maybe he died slowly, over 17 months, 3,000 people at a time, as audiences watched him disappear. Was Frank Sinatra's final tour elder abuse? The question is provocative, uncomfortable, but it needs to be asked. Medical ethicists have studied this case extensively. Dr. Peter Rabbins, a psychiatrist specializing in Alzheimer's care, was asked about the Sinatra tour in a 2005 interview. His response: "When a person with dementia expresses a desire to continue working, we have to evaluate their capacity to make that decision. If someone cannot remember what city they're in, cannot remember lyrics to songs they've sung for 50 years, and is disoriented in time and space, they likely lack the cognitive capacity to consent to public performance." In other words, Frank wanted to perform, but did he have the mental capacity to make that choice? His family argues they were honoring his wishes. Frank said he wanted to finish the tour. Who were they to override him? Taking away the stage would have killed him faster than Alzheimer's. But critics argue that when someone has advanced dementia, their stated wishes can't be trusted. A person with Alzheimer's might say they want to drive a car. That doesn't mean you give them car keys. They might say they want to manage their finances. That doesn't mean you let them. They might say they want to perform on stage in front of thousands. That doesn't mean it's ethical to let them. There's also the financial aspect. The 1993 Times Tom Belly 4 tour grossed over $43 million. Frank's estate took the majority. His family benefited. Does that matter? They argue the money was incidental. Frank would have toured for free. But the fact remains, people profited from a man with dementia performing while cognitively impaired. Tina Sinatra addresses this directly in interviews. "People think we forced him to perform for money. That's not true. Dad had more money than we could ever spend. He performed because performing was his identity. But," she pauses, "I do wonder if we should have protected him from himself. That's the guilt I carry." Barbara Marx never expressed that guilt. In her autobiography, published after Frank's death, she wrote, "Frank died a performer. He died doing what he loved. I have no regrets about the tour. He would have been miserable in retirement." Frank Jr. took a middle position. In a 2009 interview, he said, "I conducted every show. I watched my father forget songs he knew better than his own name. Was it hard? Yes. Should we have stopped? Maybe. But I also know my father. He would have hated us for stopping. So we let him perform, and I'll live with that decision for the rest of my life." The truth is probably this: everyone was right, and everyone was wrong. Barbara was right that Frank wanted to perform. Tina was right that he shouldn't have been on stage. Frank Jr. was right that stopping would have devastated him. The doctors were right that he lacked capacity to consent. All of these things can be true simultaneously. But here's what's undeniable. 12,000 people in Richmond, Virginia watched a man with Alzheimer's have a breakdown on stage. That happened. It's documented. And it didn't have to happen. Frank Sinatra spent 70 years building an image. The tough guy, the ladies' man, the chairman of the board, the man who did it my way, who lived by his own rules, answered to nobody, controlled every situation. Alzheimer's disease destroyed that image completely. It took a man who commanded presidents and reduced him to someone who couldn't remember his own address. It took a man who never showed weakness and made him cry in hotel hallways for a dead woman. It took a man whose voice defined American music and left him unable to sing his own songs. The cruelest irony is that Frank's signature song, My Way, the anthem of autonomy and control, became the song he couldn't remember. The song about doing things on his own terms was the song that exposed how little control he had left. On that stage in Richmond, when Frank reached for the lyrics and found nothing, he was living the opposite of My Way. He wasn't in control, he wasn't autonomous, he was lost, and everyone was watching. There's a photo that circulates online from that night, the one you saw at the beginning of this video. Frank, frozen mid-gesture, hand on his head, eyes vacant. That photo is more honest than any promotional image from his career. That's the real Frank Sinatra, not the legend, not the icon, the human being. Vulnerable, afraid, disappearing. And maybe that's the lesson here. We build legends, we create icons, we make people larger than life. But Alzheimer's doesn't care about your legend. It doesn't care about your 70 years of fame. It takes everything: the memories, the identity, the autonomy, the control. Frank Sinatra did many things his way, but he didn't die his way. He died the way Alzheimer's dictated, slowly, publicly, with the world watching. His final tour wasn't a victory lap, it was a public unraveling, and the people who loved him most put him on stage and let it happen, because they believed it was what he wanted. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, we'll never know, because by the time Frank was making that decision, Frank wasn't Frank anymore. The photo from Richmond is burned into the memory of everyone who was there. 12,000 people carry that image. The image of Frank Sinatra, lost on stage, searching for words that would never come again. That's the real My Way, not the triumphant anthem. The moment when My Way became I Don't Remember the Way. And that's what Alzheimer's does. It doesn't just take memories, it takes identity. And for Frank Sinatra, identity was the stage. So he stayed there, even as he disappeared, because leaving would mean admitting the disease had won. Frank Sinatra never admitted defeat, even when defeat was the only thing left. If this story affected you, please subscribe to Frank Sinatra, The Untold Legacy. We're not here to worship legends. We're here to tell the truth, the uncomfortable, human, real stories that reveal who these people actually were. Leave a comment and let's have an honest conversation. Should the family have ended the tour after Richmond? Was this love or exploitation? Is it possible for it to be both? And if you want to understand how Alzheimer's stole the final years from one of the greatest entertainers in history, check out our deep dive into Frank's relationship with Barbara Marx and how she managed his decline behind closed doors.